I can't get that recording in process thing out of my screen right now. Oh, sorry, I'm gonna have to boop. There we go. A few other things before we begin. Just because I believe in solidarity and mutual aid, I'd like you to consider, if you liked my talk, consider even donating a little bit of money to Andrew Jansen's surgery funds. Yes, even in Canada, people have to ask for money online for life-saving surgeries, in this particular case for a fused spine. There's been articles on the CBC about this. Andrew was my roommate in Nova Scotia for some time during the start of the pandemic. And if it doesn't get funded within a certain period of time, the effects to him and his life will be irreversible. So just please consider looking up his story. He's done a lot of work for the disabled community in Nova Scotia, Mi'kmaq. And again, just me in best practice. I've been watching a number of the micro learning sessions. In the comments that like settler introductions are all about like, oh, my degrees and my credentials and this that. Whereas just kind of talking about where I'm from and kind of the settler background I come from. Again, my name is Ben Mitchell, Nova Scotian and British settler from rural Mi'kmaq or Nova Scotia. Um, there's a number of colonial things in my family's past. One thing that is well cited is that some of my relatives are the reasons why there are no more oysters in Oyster Pond in Jeddore, Nova Scotia. Recognizing that even though my family's background wasn't from a particular place of wealth, the fact that my mother, as a lower class Brit, could come to Canada and get a job as not just a babysitter, but as a British nanny, that has weight. That shows kind of, yes, you can be poor and white and still have a lot of privilege vis-a-vis other groups that can represent monetary advantages. More recently, I actually found out that the Halifax Examiner, which is an investigative journalism article, paper out of Nova Scotia, is doing this expose on Verdun Mitchell. And I was like, a Mitchell from the Jeddore area, I must be related to this guy. I am. I'm curious to see what they come up with. By the sounds of it, he wasn't a good person. So I got a subscription to the Halifax Examiner so I could help fund just, finding out what skullduggery is up there. Also, I see there's some chats, but I can't read the chats myself right now. If people want to talk about that, I'm happy to. I just know that I can't see it right now. Again, a bit about me positionality-wise in terms of neurodiversity and neurodivergence. I was identified as autistic in 2019. CP has been CPTSD well before that. Possibly bipolar and ADHD. I have had one manic episode, an experience of psychosis, which was quite intense, also in 2019. 2019 was a bad year. I'm not actually a DID or dissociative identity disorder, but I've had two experiences that like felt kind of like that in a particular way. Likely have several unidentified learning disabilities, such as dysgraphia. And in comparison to some neurodivergent people, I'm a neurodivergent child from neurodivergent parents. So that kind of intergenerational experience of neurodivergence has always been part of my own personal story. Also, I know there's a lot of preamble to this, but a few kind of just trigger warnings. We will be talking about ableism, transphobia, homophobia, and a brief mention of suicide. So just to be warned, to be aware of that. Bit of an outline, just to make sure that everyone's kind of on the same page. I'd like to start off with just a kind of a recap. I've given this discussion before, just like what is neurodiversity? What do we mean when we talk about it? What are some of the terms and the language surrounding it as a concept? What are some aspects of its history as a movement? From there, we'll talk about what I call the fictional over-under-representation of neurodivergence in our media spaces, talking about, well, the Big Bang and kind of some various tropes around autism and ADHD in particular, reflecting on some of the ways in which I think this has been done well, actually, in cartoons. Think a little bit about what it means to even talk about neurodivergent culture or cultures, as I say, looking at some things about AU, ADHD, or autistic and ADHD cultures. And then also talk about the kind of like institutional and popular pushback to the concept within, like kind of trollish online spaces. Sometimes this is called fake disorder cringe, but within more kind of professional spaces and medicalized spaces, it's described as social contagion. And then kind of repeat some arguments and reinforce some arguments made by people like Dr. Devon Price about the importance of just self-identification and community identification, that external forces do not get to dictate who we are if it like helps us find community and makes our lives better in a meaningful sense. So, and I don't know if you've seen this before, that creature on the right is sometimes just called the autism creature. There's a whole bunch of pictures and art and even plushies now of it online. I love that little dude, and it's kind of like very neutral expression. I don't know, it brings me joy. Um, the idea that neurological diversity is a fundamental part of human diversity is generally considered to have developed in autistic online spaces in the 1990s and was eventually shortened to the term neurodiversity. And part of the logic here is just as biodiversity is the measure of ecological richness in a space, neurodiversity reflects the range of ways that brains and nervous systems can differ from person to person, but also importantly, the cultural and social meanings we give to these differences, right? No experience in the world is just purely objective and in there. They exist within various societies, various cultures, various infrastructures that affect our quality of lives. Someone whose neurological arrangement differs from the normative is often called neurodivergent. This is a thing that like is a personal bugbear of mine, but not everyone agrees. Like saying someone is neurodiverse is kind of like saying someone is diverse. I think it assumes that there's a normal. Usually when they say someone is diverse, what they mean is not white, and that strikes me as deeply problematic. In a similar way, when someone describes someone else as neurodivergent, it just sometimes stands as a fig leaf for not normal. Whereas I think neurodiverse, whereas neurodivergent, I think, emphasizes that just differing from the neurological kind of average. A person can be born neurodivergent or become so later in life through illness or accident. And someone who is socially and environmentally affirmed in their own performance of neurological normality is neurotypical or neuronormative. Now, importantly, the concept of neurodiversity comes from this thing called the social model of disability. And I'm going to reference some of S.K. Cap's work here in Autistic Community and the Neurodiversity Movement. It's a free and open access resource, a collection of essays. It's quite well done. If you want to look it up, I'd recommend you do so. But here he talks about how the social model of disability distinguishes between the core impairments inherent to medicalized conditions and the disability caused by societal barriers, right? The social model of disability doesn't say that people who are disabled don't have challenges that come about because of their disability, but the fact that the core concept of disability itself isn't just the bare reality of what we are, but how we relate to our society and infrastructures and like, communities and all that. That it's an emergent phenomenon. It's not just contained within the individual, it's always contained in how the individual relates to their like to the world around them. And importantly, right, like it was never made to entirely replace what's sometimes described as the medical model of disability, right, which is kind of the more traditional standard model, like, oh, there's a perceived healthy normal and standard, and everything that deviates from that is considered sick, broken, what have you, that needs to be in an ideal world normalized and brought back to a physiological and like medical kind of state of normalcy, right? That's kind of the standard and the dominant model you'll see in a lot of hospital and medicalized settings, but also in the kind of like average person's understanding of, disability on the street, right? But importantly, this concept of the social model of disability wasn't just providing an alternative. It was also intended always to be kind of an academic and political tool to empower disabled people, right? By emphasizing attention to the social obstacles that unite us, the common concerns we have. And again, just some of the things that like how the neurodiversity movement grows out of this social model of disability, that the goals of it as a political movement is the quality of life of neurodivergent people, right? Self-determination, rights, well-being, social relationships and inclusion, personal development, these sorts of things. You can't really separate disability and medicine and medical systems and social systems from political systems and questions of, yeah, importantly, self-determination, which is going to be a recurring theme in today's discussion because it's connected to, but not identical to the Mad Prive movement, which you might have heard about, as well as the psychiatric survivor or service user self-advocacy movement. They have a lot of very broad overlapping kind of concerns, but they are different kind of intellectual traditions. The Mad Prive movement coming from kind of the anti-psychiatry movement in the 60s and 70s, and the psychiatric survivor and service user self-advocacy movement, more closely related to the Mad Pride movement, about people, oftentimes people who have had encounters with the medical system that has harmed them in various ways. Myself, I have been briefly institutionalized, and it was a deeply unpleasant experience. And there's a lot of reasons why your familiarity with our healthcare systems can make you, recognize that we need to stand up for ourselves because these systems don't always represent our interests well and sometimes actively harm us. So here I just want to talk a little bit more broadly about like own voice representation and how it matters to everyone. I would like to honor you all and the place that I've been invited to speak to by bringing some of my own kind of knowledge and background, kind of trying to reflect on the ways it might relate more directly or find common cause with challenges and issues facing in Indigenous groups and movements. I don't know about you, but with my partner, I often listen to the podcast All My Relations. They had one of the earlier episodes back in 2019 was on the concept of native mascots, the very offensive, like sports mascots and stuff, and and how harmful it is to Indigenous communities when white folks just use the image of them to make money through these very derogatory, stereotypical representations, and all of the kind of social, cultural, political, financial health impacts that can have on communities that are being misrepresented by outsiders, and the very real harms that those cause. So in a previous microlearning series talk, I talked about, this concept of nothing about us without us, which is important to the disability rights movement, but came from kind of the disability rights movement intersecting with the civil rights movement and Indigenous rights as well. And I emphasized in that talk its importance in relationship to research, medical research, social research, things that are ideally going to be mobilized to make neurodivergent people's lives better. But I would argue that not only does it just apply to media representations as well, but media representations are in many ways more important than research representations, because I would argue media representations are in some ways more primary, right? The average person's understanding of autism, of ADHD, of schizophrenia, bipolarity, of all of the things under the rubric of neurodiversity are shaped by the television shows they watch, the books they read, the way it's talked about on the evening news by people who may or may not really know what they're talking about from like a own voice perspective. And that kind of cultural norms and assumptions and biases then feed into cultures of research and cultures of medicine and those things, which then directly affect our lives in a very tangible way. Oop. I just want to talk a little bit about just like what I'm not talking about. Oftentimes in media, you'll see the trope of madness. It's often invoked when people don't really want to dig too deeply into character motivations or explorations of behavior. Sometimes it also serves as a romanticization of genius, which historically has been tied up with notions of madness for centuries, at least in the European literature. And I'm not going to really focus explicitly on villains in this talk. The disabled villain trope is a well-acknowledged trope at this point, either with facial disfigurations or mental different cognitive differences. I want to talk about more things that people, like have told me they think is good representation, and then I look at and I'm like, oh, that's a bad time. That's a bad time. And this relates to what I would describe as the fictional over-under representation of neurodivergence, right? Because I think that, as I mentioned, I answered some of the questions before the talk. Fictional characters are often implicitly coded as neurodivergent because we are generally interested in narratives about people who simply just don't do things that most people do, right? Featuring extremes of personality, characterization, emotion, energy, trauma, right? That's very common in most of our media, I'd argue. It's seldom that a media kind of emphasizes this is a completely average person doing completely average things that does not deviate in any way, and that brings with it a certain understanding of like yeah who we watch and also people are very fond of using neurodivergence as a metaphor without necessarily understanding what neurodivergence is and the different very specific experiences, right? And how it's not just one thing. The experiences of someone who is schizophrenic are very different than someone who's bipolar, someone who's autistic, ADHD, all of those things. But this also doesn't mean that this representation is intentional or beneficial to neurodivergent people. It's well informed or even community focused. And this is a very old trope within our media. Rain Man, which is kind of a bit of more of an older reference point now, was the highest grossing film of 1988. In it, Dustin Hoffman's character is supposedly an autistic savant. You might have heard that term, where like, he can't necessarily like sum up the like, 10 minus 5, but he can do incredibly complicated calculations in his brain and that sort of thing. The character that Dustin Hoffman's character was based on, as it turned out, wasn't even autistic, but kind of for decades became kind of one of the things that people thought about when they thought about autistic people. And this highlights another issue in terms of like, the monetary dimension here, right? Alia Gilbert, in this article I found from 2018, Oscars So Able, the overwhelming frequency of non-disabled actors portraying disabled characters. They make the point that like so many of the best actors portrayed characters facing considerable mental or physical barriers who won Oscar awards. Right? Like a huge, huge number of them. And that's a weird pattern, right? Particularly since none of them I'll make the exception of Anthony Hopkins because I don't think the author knew at the time that Anthony Hopkins actually is autistic. He was identified in his 70s. But for the vast majority of them, they do not experience the challenges. They're not disabled in the ways or that their characters are representing. And then that begs the question, well, okay, then who's making all of this money off of representing us? Right? It's not disabled folks. But also, this Oscar baiting doesn't always work, right? Um, Two examples, if you come to my other talk, you know I've talked about All in a Row, which was a play that was a deeply misguided play. You can look that up if you want. It's a bad time. And also Sia's music, the Australian musician. Sia is a complicated and interesting case because even though this musical is considered to be grossly offensive by the vast majority of the autistic community, Sia has recently come out and been identified as autistic herself, leaning into some tropes. She made an apology in 2023. Whether how you feel about that, it's complicated, right? You've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. There's a lot of us that are quite solid, and some of us are Elon Musk, and that's just something we got to deal with. Like, yep, that's a thing. So, in terms of though, like more modern understandings of autism or neurodivergence in like a popular imagination, it's hard to escape the Big Bang Theory. I don't know how many of you have seen this show. I've tried not to see this show, and it still comes up a lot. I was in the unfortunate position before I knew I was autistic of my very autistic mother making fun of me for being Sheldon Cooper a lot, a great deal. And kind of like, but once I finally said like, wait, no, I am autistic, then that all stopped. But it's a trope. The way the people think about autism, this kind of like white cis male figure who's kind of like geeky and doesn't really care about people's feelings and only understands logic, has become kind of one of the average kind of representations that people have to work with. People who know nothing about neurodivergence or autism be like, oh yeah, like it's the Big Bang Theory. We're just laughing at all of these nerds, right? This was explicitly described as Big Bang bucks in Forbes at one point, right? Because depicting disabled people is $1 billion industry, and there's so many shows that have had very little, if any, input by affected communities that are making a lot of money off of representing us. Big Bang Theory is the most prominent, but there's others. Atypical is another one, which I found deeply problematic. The Good Doctor is another one. But there's a lot. It is having a bit of a cultural moment here. Love on the Spectrum. I know some people like it. I'm not a huge fan of it at all. There's a lot of money is being made by non-disabled people and non-neurodivergent people by representing and putting neurodivergent people on screen or claiming to represent them. Right? This is the one I've seen a lot. Autism on TV. I say insulting things to people, and when they are upset, I argue with their logic instead of apologizing. Autism in real life. A friend hasn't spoken to me in a few days, so I'm analyzing everything I have ever said to them in case I was rude and they hate me now. Mood. Right? Like there's very different ways that it gets represented. And I want to kind of just unpack the Big Bang Theory a little bit more because I think that it's representative of a lot of common strategies that we see in representations of neurodivergence in media, right? Like one of the refrains of Sheldon Cooper is, my mother had me tested. Like they never specify tested for what, but the running joke and the thing that is left unsaid there is tested for autism, right? Like that's never actually said in the series, right? The writers themselves have repeatedly gone on record saying Sheldon Cooper, the character, is not autistic. And the one actor who is actually a PhD in neuroscience, when asked about autism, they evade the question. She says, "By we don't pathologize our characters." But that already kind of like assumes a certain degree of, like a medical model of understanding of what autism even is, right? It's a bit slippery, I feel, right? Because if you don't think autism is a pathology necessarily, then like that doesn't even apply to this case. It's not answering the question, really. It's evading the question. And I think it's quite informative, right? I sometimes describe this as the autism that dare not speak its name. right? Because when the actor himself who plays Sheldon Cooper, this character Jim Parsons here, was interviewed about it back in 2009, right? He has this interesting thing to say when he asked the writers if Sheldon had Asperger's. It's an older form of referencing autism for those of you who don't know, but it's considered very problematic because Asperger was a Nazi who was basically like, some of these kids we can still use to serve the Reich, but the other ones we're going to murder. That's why people don't like using Asperger's anymore. It was used to just filter out the ones that like the state could still extract value from. Um, but yeah, the writer said, no, he doesn't. That's not what we're doing. But he actually looked into this book, right? This Look Me in the Eye. And after he did read this narrative of a person who was autistic, that was recommended to him by another show member who commented just how much this reminds him of Sheldon, read it, and said the comparisons were undeniable. Right? The showrunners are never going to say that Sheldon Cooper is autistic because it's really in their interest to never admit that. But you don't have to say that, you just say he has weird prosody in how he speaks, he has weird obsessions, he has weird kind of like emotional responses and patterns of thinking. He's not autistic, he just has all of these things that are often associated with autism, but like we can laugh at those, right? Because we're not laughing at autism. That's something very different. And this kind of trope of the autism that dare not speak its name is actually quite common, where they use euphemisms or indirect references, right? In the case of the Power Rangers movie, right, the character describes very briefly has a mention of himself being on the spectrum. The actor who played the Blue Ranger himself is not autistic, and when asked about it, had this very generalized thing to say, just like, well, it's great that anyone can imagine themselves a hero without showing any understanding of what he was representing on screen. The video game To the Moon is quite interesting because in some ways the whole thing is about autism and a neurotypical person's relationship with his autistic partner, but it never says the word. It really talks around it a lot. And more recently, Dead End Paranormal Park, the character Norma on my left, she is explicitly stated in the notes as being autistic, but it's never mentioned actually in the show, which is interesting, right? Both autism and Judaism are represented in the show without being like explicitly mentioned. They have a whole episode on Norma being bi. Barney, the character on the blue-haired character, is, explicitly talks about being gay and trans, and these are kind of like focal points for the show, but they only kind of like Barney wear a Star of David at one point, and Norma's autism is never talked about. And I'm just interested, like, why is that? Is that they feel like they have to pick their battles? Is it like, why do the showrunners feel the need to do that? But it happens so often. Boop. Let's see. So, checking in on the time, I've been talking at you for a little bit. I just want to take a little bit of a break to kind of ask you some questions about, well, just a question, I guess. Are there representations of neurodivergence in media that you particularly like or dislike? And I'll just take a pause out here to stop the share so I can also see those questions. So I'm not just talking at you the entire time. Oop. Love on the Spectrum. Now, you love that. Okay, fair. I don't want to yuck your yum. I find it a little bit exploitative personally, but a lot of folks can find it very validating. If you mind asking, if you mind reflecting, what do you like about it? Why do you enjoy it so much? You don't have to answer that, but if you want to, just kind of reflect on.
I have a quick question.
I like that they show
Um,
autistic. Oh, sorry, yes, Chevy.
yeah,
Chevy?
can newer, yeah, Chevy Rabbit. I'm a
Chevy.
student at MCC. Can these be seen as a gift, like through different cultures?
I
Like,
mean, oh, sorry, yeah, go for it.
yeah, because I feel like our brain overcompensates. So if we're like, say, we're bipolar type 2 or ADHD or some kind of mental wellness, I feel like sometimes our brain overcompensates in different areas.
Mhm. The language of giftedness is an interesting one. right? Because I mean, certainly, number of cultures, including my understanding of Cree culture, is very limited. But my understanding is it is viewed as more of just like a difference and like a special ability rather than a defect. And that's yeah. There's lots of different cultural understandings of differences. I know I know little bit about the Maori culture's relationship, for example, to autism. That it is just more viewed as a difference rather than a pathology that gives unique abilities. I don't remember the word off the top of my head, but I think the translation for it is like someone who just does some things in their own time, in their own way, which I think is kind of lovely. It's someone who struggles to work in the 9 to 5 capitalist system that we live under. Um, I would caution a little bit about like just like saying like, oh, like autism is my superpower, because you see those discussions around ADHD or autism, which often feed into the like, oh no, it's okay because we're more exploitable by capitalism, right? A lot of placement organizations that try to find jobs because the autistic unemployment rate is very high, they just focus on, they're like, no, there's value added qualities here, right?
Yeah,
Oh, sorry, yeah.
yeah, yeah, I agree. Like, there's really no place. There's all this talk about mental wellness. I was in a campaign not too long ago where commercials were coast to coast about mental wellness. But when I really talk with government officials, like in my work that I do as an advocate, there's really no space and there's no accommodation for mental wellness in the workplace in the
Mhm,
capitalistic market, and
mhm,
also that many uh, people who already have barriers, say on racialized barriers,
mhm.
if they have that added like autism or another mental wellness, it actually adds more barriers. It actually, you can't really have a
Mhm.
superpower or a gift because it just ends up being another barrier.
Yeah, I know. I think you're quite right. And this is one of the reasons why the community, large numbers of the community, not everyone, because it's a community and there's going to be different voices, are very suspicious of the language of functioning labels. Because usually, if you're described as gifted or high functioning, it's just used to deny you support. Whereas if you're described as like low functioning, it's used to deny you autonomy and your own rights. Like it's a trap either way. It's, but yeah, just to answer, look at some of the questions that are written out as well. Laura M says there have been arguments that the entire cast of characters in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia on the spectrum. I like that idea because those characters are certainly not positive portrayals, and I like it when neurodivergent characters aren't portrayed as one-dimensional saints. And I think you're quite right, Laura, that like yeah, no, at the same good representation just doesn't mean that like you're represented as a perfect human being, because that has its own problems. It's a diversity of representation. And there are definitely bad, I would think morally bad autistic people in the world. See my earlier comments re Elon Musk. Um, I've never actually seen Always Sunny in Philadelphia, so I can't actually speak to it as a cultural product. Um, it is interesting the ways in which, and I'll talk a little bit about the concept of headcanoning and like how that relates to the like neurodivergent communities a little bit later in the talk. Uh, Gabriella says, sorry, I'm just wondering what about The Good Doctor is seen as not good or why folks might be upset with the show. I found I really like the show, but I have ADHD and not autism, so I'm curious for the other perspective. Is it because the actor themselves is not autistic? That is part of it. Generally, it is considered to be poor form. Because it's so common, right? It's depressingly common. It's, again, drawing parallels between the understandable ways in which Indigenous folks are very upset when Johnny Depp, plays an Indigenous character and all these other characters, people making money off of stereotypical representations of groups that they don't belong to, right? And don't really have an understanding or appreciation of. I have only seen a bit of The Good Doctor. Um, but part of my understanding is that it feeds into this kind of autistic savant trope. Like I've seen the jokes and the stuff around people being like, oh, I didn't I wait, like, non-autistic people don't have that autism like heads up display of like all the facts and information that they're just like rapidly parsing through. Like that's, it feeds into these kind of autistic savant stereotypes, which, some of us are just allowed to be autistic and not good at even things that we are deeply passionate about. I don't think I should say I don't think The Good Doctor is as egregious as some, but it's been criticized by the community for its feeding into certain tropes, and again for the main character not being autistic and them not really doing a lot of like obvious research into the varieties of autistic experience. Um, Marisol says, under the umbrella of Neurodivergent, as someone that has OCD, one show I like to watch is Monk, as it is a show that is accurate in the extreme of OCD. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, thank you for adding that, Marisol. I've seen some Monk. Like, I struggle with shows like that because I don't always know if people are laughing with us or at us. in those situations. I think part like I am not OCD myself, but I have friends who are OCD, and I do recognize that it brings with it a lot of intense challenges that people who just joke about them, wanting one thing a particular way, oh, I'm OCD, that's deeply not helpful. But no, good to know that you think that it is actually accurate. Because yeah, with Monk, I wasn't sure. Like, are they just making fun of him? Have they done research? Like, what does this look like? And that's the tricky thing too about representation, right? Because it is just because I know a lot about autism, ADHD, and a few other things, I can't say that I don't know the lived experience of OCD myself. I can say, oh, I have some friends who are OCD, but that's still deeply removed from the visceral experience of it.
Hi, can
Yep.
I respond to you something? Yeah, so the show, one of the things that I like about it is
Hmm.
that it shows how it can be if you don't work on OCD, like being like recovery, because the
Hmm.
show shows Monk going to therapy, but
Hmm.
not doing what the standard for OCD therapy is, ERP.
Hmm.
He attempts that throughout the series, but doesn't really improve on his symptoms.
Hmm.
So as someone that has OCD watching
Hmm.
the show, it kind of makes me feel better that I am doing the work
Hmm.
with my OCD. Um, but it also kind of it's one part of OCD.
Hmm.
He is, germs, which is, cleaning and one aspect.
Hmm.
But then there's that, the list of what he's afraid of, which
Hmm.
is, milk and um, ladybug.
Hmm.
And so those are the other different subcategories of OCD that what I like about it is that it gets people talking about it,
Hmm.
and not
That's fair.
just that. So it's also for its time, it was I think it began maybe in the late 2000s.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
bringing that conversation. There's also a recent movie,
Oh,
and
that's right. Yeah.
yeah, in Peacock, a recent movie that brings back Monk and how he handled COVID-19. And I was not as extreme as he was,
Hmm.
but I could see how I could have gone that avenue of COVID-19
Hmm.
obsessive behavior. So
Hmm.
um, for what it is and for characters, I think it, it opens the door for more accurate representation and
Okay.
discussion like this one that we're having, which is
Hmm.
something that I think is
Okay. Yeah. No, I think that's fair to say because, like, also, like, I can't think of many other popular media representations of OCD outside of Monk. Still, I mean, so yeah, it is true. Like, even like okay or neutral representation is better than nothing, to be sure. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Let's see. Anna Boric. I liked Extraordinary Attorney Wu, less because of the main actor's portrayal and more because of their cinematographic representations of things like overstimulation, and also the other characters' reactions to Attorney Wu, including her father, which, while not always kind, felt emotionally sincere in a way I don't think always happens in media. And that's fair. I admit that like I struggled with it a bit. I didn't finish it just because like there's that scene in the courtroom where she's talking about how like what's more pathetic than a disabled person, and like I was like I don't know where this place like I don't have the Korean cultural context. I don't know, the degree to which like that context is very different. I just struggled with it myself in that case. But yeah, no, it's very artistically represented and beautiful in many ways. I think you're quite right in terms of the cinematography. Okay, good stuff. Thank you, Thor. But all right. Yeah, fair, right? Like that's the thing too, right? Like concepts of like prejudice and representation, good representation will differ depending on what culture you're talking about. Um, so I don't feel particularly skilled to speak in terms of that, but I know that Extraordinary Attorney Wu has been kind of breaching containment and coming into kind of a Western European kind of like entertainment space. Yeah. But if folks, we can have another question period a little bit later, but I might kind of continue on here. Folks are okay with that. Oop. So here I just want to talk a little bit about, I don't think everything's going to be okay as a perfect show. There's things I didn't like about it, but I think it was interesting because it's one of the few examples I know of, though it didn't last very long, of a show about neurodivergence, again, particularly like autism and ADHD, that the main showrunner himself was not just autistic and ADHD, but was a character in it, portraying someone coming to an understanding of themselves as someone who is autistic and ADHD. In this particular narrative, one of the main autistic characters, Kyla Cromer, that's the actress's name, I should stress. She plays the character of Matilda, but she's very openly and out as an autistic actress. Joss Thomas himself is a gay autistic ADHD actor and was the showrunner for this particular show. And it's again not uncomplicated. It's the show didn't really get a lot of chance to breathe. I don't know what like narrative direction it was taking before it was canceled, but one of the through threads in it is, both Josh Thomas's character coming to an understanding of himself as autistic, and Matilda's sister kind of trying to sort out her relationship to Matilda as a character. Right, at one point she says, "I thought I knew everything about autism. It turns out I just know everything about Matilda," i.e., her sister. Right, this is kind of like reinforcing the point that if you met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, that there are so many, because autism is characterized by, sometimes what I've described as a spiky skill set or profiles, we are characterized by extremes, right? I didn't really understand how I was related to my parents until I started understanding autism. I tend to be very sensory sensitive to things like sounds and overstimulation, whereas both of my parents have trouble controlling the volume of their voice. They yell a lot, not just because of anger, just because it fluctuates. They get bored very quickly. They make a lot of noise constantly, and that was constantly harming me in a way that I didn't really understand until I started learning about autism. And, like they tend to be very hyposensitive in terms of things that I'm hypersensitive to. And it really helped me understand just like it's such a huge, it again tends to be characterized by extremes rather than just one thing. Talking about some things that in terms of like representation in cartoons, I mentioned this a bit in answering some of the questions that were posed before the talk, but animation and particularly like kids' cartoons are kind of an interesting space for representation because I don't know if it's because like because they're seen as kind of a lesser art form in our society, that they have more freedoms, or that people who are have certain forms of marginalization tend to end up finding work there because it's considered to be somewhat of a lesser cultural form of cultural expression in our society. But in the past, like 5 years or so, there's been, I guess I'm getting older, 5, 10 years or so, there's been some interesting representations of neurodivergence, and particularly autism and ADHD in kids media, right? In this particular case, I don't know how many of you have seen She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, and from 2018 to 2021, I think. I can't actually see that side of the screen with this. But the showrunner Noelle Stevenson confirmed that Entrapta is specifically autistic, right? Like they don't often necessarily say this, like the Big Bang Theory people will never, but like when they are willing to say, no, this character is autistic, that shows a certain commitment to representation, right? And they talk about the one reason why this was because one of the board artists, Sam Zemansky, is autistic and was actually consulted quite a bit in Entrapta's thinking process, in her sensory differences, and even in the way she's embodied, moved, and speaks, right? Like there's sometimes things described as like the autistic accent or like the very unusual way that we move our bodies because we experience them differently than other people, right? What's described as proprioception is different, right, than others. So we sometimes will move differently. This is just a tweet kind of confirming that, right? And her physical acting ideas for her arc, narrative dimensions, which was quite interesting to see, right? I think, and again, like that's the case where like Entraptor is kind of like a morally neutral character. Like she means well, but she's sometimes on the bad guy's side, sometimes on the good guy's side, because she's just really interested in doing her own thing. I think she's kind of an interesting example of a character who's played as kind of like generally wants to do well, but is also kind of morally ambiguous and gray in children's media, which is again quite interesting, right? It's also interesting in terms of her like relationship to like intense emotions and feelings because she's presented as a very crafty, tool-oriented person who's building machines and stuff. And oftentimes she has these masks that literal masks that she wears, and particularly puts on when she's feeling emotionally overwhelmed. I don't know how many of you have been aware of the Chuck Tingle debacle about him being invited to speak at a library event in Texas and then disinvited because he won't not wear his mask. But like literal masks sometimes help autistic people function in the world in a way that a lot of people consider to be cringe. And there needs to be space to talk about that. One really good example of ADHD representation in children's media is the Owl House. And I think it's also interesting both because it didn't start off intending like to be that way, but it also kind of coincided with the showrunner, Dana Terrence, kind of realizing that she's ADHD. It's interesting to see the unfolding of this kind of narrative, right? Like when asked about it in 2020, the showrunner, the person who was, the main designer of the show, said Luz Noceda, again, important, right? The main character here, pictured here, was not written specifically with ADHD in mind, but more from observations from myself and my classmates slash buddies from high school. If that's a trait for something, perhaps I'm learning something about myself that I never knew. And then literally the year later, she was like, okay, yes, loses ADHD. Kind of understand. You can see the interview there where she talks about it in the link near time code 10700. And one of the things I think is, I mean, there's a few things that are really noteworthy about the Owl House's representation of Luz as an ADHD and neurodivergent person, right? She's not white, she's not a cis man or cis boy, right? These are important things in and of themselves. But also, I think narratively, one of the more interesting aspects of Luz's kind of narrative arc is the thing that sets her up in this world, right? She starts off, she's having trouble in school. She's just different. She does weird, sometimes creepy things, but it's kind of enthusiasm. I think she's deeply charming, but like her teachers don't think that. So her mother, not wanting her to suffer in the same way she did, sends her to this camp that is supposed to normalize her, which in and of itself is kind of sinister. Rather than go to that camp, she finds a portal to another world. It's kind of an isekai, kind of like otherworld fantasy. But even when she's there in this demon realm, and going to school in the demon realm, she finds that she can't learn to do magic the way that other people in this world do it. She's a different being. They're demons, she's humans, right? So she has to find her own way to learn. And that emphasis on Luz coming to understand not just, how she fits into the world, but how she learns differently from other people and then comes into a mastery of that, her own unique form of learning, I think is a really interesting neurodivergent ADHD kind of narrative, right? Because oftentimes, I've known so many of my friends, so many of my social circle who deeply intelligent, talented people who struggled terribly in school because that system just did not work for them. Some of the most talented, like craft people whose spatial relationships or and sense of space is so much better than mine, dropped out of school because it was just so much of an upsetting experience for them that didn't work with how they learned. And I think that this is a really interesting example of like really exploring different neurodivergent patterns of learning. So I've been talking a lot about like the concept of a neurodivergent culture, but it's a little bit of a bait and switch, I must confess, right? Because neurodivergent people, we're not an ethnic category, right? We're kind of part of an interlocking system of disabled communities with a strong heritable element. And in but we're also akin to like 2S LGBTQIA plus communities in a lot of key aspects, which we'll talk about. And while there are family resemblances, there is no one neurodivergent culture, right? But that said, just as resistance to the harms perpetuated by colonialism, racism, ableism, transphobia, homophobia, and all those have informed cultures, so too his neurodivergent culture as a broad entity kind of been characterized by its resistance to and the effects of ableism and neuroantagonistic ableism, right? So that even though we have all of these differences, there are some common features because of the ways in which society tends to treat us. Right. And one of the interesting regards here is that we've seen an explosion, really since the advent of the internet, in a more self-conscious, self-organized, particularly autistic rights movement, but also other forms of neurodivergence because of the internet, right? And this has been commented on by critical autism scholars and other folks for the past 20 years, really, right? Autistic worlds have grown immeasurably because of the internet. And I think that's something important to keep in mind, that we can like find each other better now, right? Um, yeah, but that also will be, as we'll see, a point that people use to dismiss. That's not a word. Diminish or dismiss us. That's what I should have said. Um, and just to kind of relate to that, like not all neurodivergent people or autistic people are really into video games, but I think it's quite interesting that some of the existing or emerging scholarship around the intersection of neurodiversity and video games kind of also emphasizes kind of the role that video games have in self-expression, the role that they have in, you know, allowing us to navigate spaces differently, and can get control of a narrative in contexts where we often don't feel like we have control. But also the critical analysis of the ways in which, like, there's a whole, I don't know if you've heard of the serious games movement. I'm not a huge fan of it myself, but they're games that specifically exist to, like, like train certain aspects of ADHD out of someone, or like, respond to this or respond to that. They're viewed as medical interventions in a very particular way. And how I personally think that's kind of antithetical to neurodivergent community building and engagement with each other and sharing experiences. And so at this point, I don't if you've explored this topic, there are so many now like YouTube channels and podcasts and things talking about different aspects of cultures. Again, as often is the case, autistic and ADHD culture are way overrepresented in these media spaces. You'll see fewer things about OCD or FASD or schizophrenia, bipolar. And another thing, right? Because there's discussions within the neurodiversity movement about, like, how do we relate to our disability? Is it just a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it a mixed thing? Do we just need accommodations? I think it's quite telling that a lot more people who are bipolar have a more ambivalent relationship to neurodiversity as a movement. As someone who's had a manic experience, I don't want to define my life in relationship to that. That was a very scary time for me. Um, but it happened, right? As opposed to, my kind of more autistic and possibly ADHD ways of being in the world, which like really adds a lot to like both the ways I appreciate the world and like the things I like about myself, but has also contributed to challenges and is just kind of an ongoing basis, as opposed to the one intense manic episode I had in 2019. And it's important to create space that honors both of those perspectives. So you might have heard of some of these things about like autistic culture, like spins or special interests, right? Like oftentimes both ADHD and autistic folks, we have things we're really into, really intensely into, more so than just a hobby or like, that's really how I generally try to make friends with people. I've gone to parties and just be like, so what are you passionately interested in? And oftentimes people just treat me like I'm a weirdo and I'm not very good at making friends at party. But that's part of how I engage with the world. That's related to info dumping, right? Like if an autistic person cares about you, they will throw a lot of information or things that they've learned at you. That's kind of a love language. Or, oh, I know, like I have a friend, I know that they're into like the Mongol Empire. Every single time I come across something that's related to the Mongol Empire, I send it to them. That's just like, that's how I show I care about people. Stims are another common one between ADHD and autistic kind of use, right? Like the thing, because we have proprioception and interoception kind of differences, we're often doing things with our hands or, sounds, textures that we just find help us think and engage with the world. You'll notice for me, for instance, I'm swaying like a cobra right now. That's an aspect I have a hard time, particularly when I get excited and invested in a topic, not moving while I'm talking. It helps me process, it helps me think. But I also have just things I play with and fidget. It's one of the reasons why I like having vests. I have all sorts of different jingly jangly things in there. And like that's a big part of ADHD and autistic culture, just giving space for that, right? Playing with speech. This one hasn't been specifically studied, but it's something I've noticed in a lot of my circles and other online spaces. That like because oftentimes, though not always, we have speech differences, either being completely nonverbal or, struggling to like get our words out or misplacing words or saying funny words or saying words in an unusual way and with an emphasis that is different than others, that sometimes we just enjoy playing with that fact, right? And being silly and fun with it, which is something I appreciate. Autistic culture is also characterized by safe foods. A lot of us have very particular like texture or like sensory aversions or things we seek out, for example, and just kind of respecting that. They're like, oh, why can't you just eat something else? I've gone hungry at times because I'm like, I don't have the executive function to find or get the food I feel like I can eat right now. So I guess I'm not eating. Like it's a challenge sometimes, right? It's one of the reasons why we can be so upset. We're like, oh no, they've discontinued this one brand of sandwich or something that I like because it takes a lot of cognitive effort to try to start eating new things, for example. Masking is another big one that's not considered to be kind of a, like an affirmed thing in a lot of autistic cultures, but like autistic masking is when you're hiding your autistic traits, right? Or ADHD traits. A lot of different cultures like have to do this when they exist in kind of a complicated power relationship with dominant societies. I mean, it's sometimes described as oh wow, I'm blanking on the word now. Was it case shifting? No. When black folks switch from African American vernacular to kind of like the phone operator English when dealing with white folks. That sort of thing. It's common across cultures. When oh, is that a answer to me? But yeah, that's one aspect of autistic masking and ADHD masking. Um, but also sometimes it's literally wearing masks to just kind of like not have to freak out about what my face is doing. Because I can sometimes have a very neutral expression, but also can be incredibly animated in ways that people find funny. And I too sometimes struggle with just letting myself wear sunglasses when it's too bright out for me, but also like not feeling like I have to be so aware of what my face is doing because I know it behaves differently than other people's, and particularly folks who have very neutral affect or like their face doesn't express a lot of emotion. You can be made to feel very insecure and have this weird relationship to yourself when you're constantly being told that your authentic expressions of emotion and feeling, interest, and concern don't seem real to other people, right? And that's a problem. And also a thing I want to talk about in a little bit more depth, fandoms, right? Hopefully some of you have heard the term fandoms before. It's just we're into something. You're really into, sports or comic books. In this case, your interest taught me something new about just how extreme interest can be. This one YouTuber I follow is talking about their interest in Spider-Man. And in relation to that, like headcanons, right? The ways in which, there's not a lot of good or even for some cases, almost any representation of various forms of neurodivergence. So people who do have those experiences, like, okay, this story that I've heard, well, now this character is autistic. You see that also in like LGBTQ spaces where like, oh, this character I like is trans now, deal with it. We're going to tell a story. It makes a lot of sense to me, right? I have this picture from Lilo and Stitch on because a lot of folks in the autistic community think of Lilo as a potentially autistic child. And that's been discussed a lot in terms of her characterization in the Disney movies. And this has been a big part of neurodivergent culture for a very long time. I don't know how many of you have read Steve Silverman's Neurotribes from 2015, but he actually kind of emphasized the way in which, like, even in the early 20th century, early what we would describe as fandom culture, someone who's like so into something was potentially like developed by neurodivergent people, ADHD and autistic folks in particular, right? He cites the case of this sci-fi editor and author Hugo Gernsback. Again, this is like old, like 1960s style, kind of like sci-fi, who actually invented for himself this thing called the isolator, which, if you don't know the context, feels like kind of like a corporate capitalist nightmare of just endless productivity. But if you actually like think about it in terms of the possibility that Hugo Gernsback was autistic, he's trying to deal with intrusive sensory stimulations that he can't navigate otherwise, right? One of the things about kind of particularly autistic, but I think it's also common with ADHD kind of sensory perceptions, is that for like the kind of neuronormative baseline is you habituate to stimuli. So like if a noise is clattering in the room and you can't do anything about it, eventually your brain will just block it out. Whereas for a lot of autistic and ADHD folks, rather than just blocking it out, it becomes more intrusive, and it can really, really affect your emotional regulation, focus, all of that. Star Trek is one that gets talked about a lot in relationship to both fandoms and autism. This is just a meme. Shout out to autistic coded Star Trek characters that constantly have their personhood questioned and possess at least one of the following: deep shame, inferiority, insecurity, and or self-hatred. Got to be one of my favorite genders. That's just a thing to bear out. Oftentimes in the discussions around fandom and fan culture, a lot of us will glom onto non-human characters, robots, fey beings, creatures. I know I do, because oftentimes when a character is made to be an autistic representation, they're kind of a stereotype in a way we don't connect to. But if they do have these other qualities that a neuronormative person is developed to just be kind of inhuman in some ways, we actually find them really engaging and like familiar and like relatable. In the case where like Data literally has his humanity questioned in the measure of man, I remember seeing that as a child and being deeply fascinated by it. Um, and like Data is a character, they talk about how he doesn't have feelings, but like it's apparent that he does. Like the decisions that he makes, the fact that he has a cat named Spot that he like dotes on, like And the ways in which characters constantly talk about how he doesn't have feelings, the way he himself talks about how he doesn't have feelings, and yet how he manifests them in all of these ways is a very common experience for autistic folks who often have our humanity questioned in particular ways. That said, we're a large community. Not everyone likes being related to, robots and monsters and creatures. And that's something that also requires, sensitivity to. But I'd argue that, yeah, there's a lot of interest in the fandoms about that. That in fact, we've been creating culture ourselves for free for decades and decades now. And so it's kind of exists in this kind of juxtaposition between the kind of Big Bang Bucks model I talked about earlier, where non-disabled creators are making a lot of money off of representing us, and the spontaneous things we do to create our own community and culture, because, well, we need that to survive, right? You need to find things that are representative of you in the stories you tell and in the stories you connect to. At the same time, with the growth of various kind of neurodivergent cultures online, there has been a backlash, because there's always a backlash, right? Within kind of more bullying and trollish space, we have things like the Reddit server r/fake disorder cringe. And you have people on like Twitter being like, you all weren't depressed and gender fluid and neurodivergent 10 years ago. And people being like, oh yeah, I was just waiting for the launch of autism in 2013, right? Like kind of like making fun of that. They're like, well, there was no common language for it. It wasn't commonly understood then, but that doesn't mean we didn't exist. I myself have existed since 1985, for example. I was just different and weird and struggling and had no way of understanding my experiences being in special education in school and all those sorts of things. It wasn't until literally I was identified as autistic in 2019 after having a horrific breakdown that I even began to start understanding my life. And then you talk to people, and then you understand people more. Then you share things with people, and then people say, "Oh, wait, maybe if that what makes you autistic, is that what makes you ADHD? Maybe I am too." Like it's definitely a pattern. And then you realize almost all your social circle is not neuronormative, and maybe it was kind of obvious all along if you were really paying attention, or if you even, I shouldn't say it that way, if you even understood what to look for. But part of this backlash isn't new, right? At the turn of the 2000s, we saw this spread of media basically calling ADHD fake, right? Which weirdly exists in this kind of complementary but opposite relationship to people who say that everything is giving you ADHD these days. First of all, not thinking of it almost like a contagion, which it's not. It's just you're born that way. I don't know how many of you watch The Simpsons or South Park or King of the Hill. If you do, I'm sorry you have such bad taste. No, I'm just kidding. I'm being a bit weird there. But they all had episodes, and sometimes multiple episodes, that the point of the episode was ADHD doesn't exist, right? Like, and why is that? Why do these dominant cultural narratives have to dismiss us, right? What's to be gained there by that kind of symbolic annihilation, right? But oftentimes it's like, oh, ADHD doesn't exist. You just have to be, harder and stricter with kids about their like discipline, and like raising them right and that sort of thing. It feeds into this kind of conservative backlash very tidily, and has for decades now. And here I want to talk a little bit about transphobia, because I think there's a lot of parallels between the medicalized and stigmatized ways that trans experience is discussed, and those experienced by neurodivergent folks. you know and they use this concept in the medical literature called social contagion, and it can be a real thing in a more limited scope, as we've seen in the case of like suicides and other, things like that. It can be an issue, like harms and trauma spreads throughout a community in very obvious ways that can be quantified and measured. But the term social contagion itself is also used to discredit marginalized peoples, right? This book, Irreversible Damage, is kind of like a textbook example of that. Yeah, it's described trans folks as an epidemic and a craze, and it's just like, oh, you're not really trans, just all your friends tell you you are, and it's fake, and it's not real, and it's never existed. It's this weird, like, modern pretension, ignoring the fact that trans folks have always existed, and there's so many, like, in so many different cultures. Gender variance is huge. So many different cultures around the world have had multiple genders beyond the kind of gender binary that Europeans loved in the 19th century. I'm not gonna, I see that I'm taking a little bit of time, so I'm just gonna skip over this quickly. But yeah, like there's a lot of discourse around this. If you're interested, Alexander Avila has an interesting video on YouTube called TikTok Gave Me Autism, The Politics of Self-Diagnosis, right? And importantly, if anyone's using the term social contagion, they often are framing neurodivergent people as intrinsically pathological rather than as just like a different way of existing in the world. It might have it does tangibly have physiological, bases. My brain is different, um, but that doesn't mean it's pathological by nature. Generally, pardon me, if we're not isolated, passive, and deferential to medical and state authority, then we must be faking and just in it for the social capital, right? You see this a lot in kind of like conservative backlashes to all sorts of identities and ways of being in the world when like it doesn't serve you, like no one's being trans for the social credit they get. Because if you, depending on how many trans people are in your community, you're well aware of just all the stuff folks have to deal with, all the hate crimes, all the stigma and prejudice and like loss of jobs and everything that folks are facing. And it's quite similar with the neurodivergent community. Like I'm very open about now, well, mostly open to most of my colleagues about being autistic and possibly ADHD. I'm going through the process of getting that sorted out now. But I'm not totally out to all the people, particularly in upper administration, because I do not trust them because they have said some pretty egregious things to me in the past that means I can't trust them, right? There's a lot of memes about this now, like the ways that people talk about the war on autism and the fact that, like, no, we're fighting back on the side of autism. But in the more kind of professional literature, this still persists, right? This stigma of self-diagnosis or self-identification and the treating of it as this kind of fad, right? This is in the Psychiatric Times, I found, which is a peer-reviewed, kind of practice-oriented psychiatric publication, right? It's not just some randos on TikTok deciding to be awful that day. This has gone through a process. A lot of people with a lot of degrees have looked at this. And this issue is particularly striking. It's quite recent, right? It's from May of 2023. Psychoeducation or psychiatric contagion, social media and self-diagnosis, right? And then the highlighted text is, I have autism, all my friends say so. And it was hard to go over this section because, like, when you're studying things that relate so deeply to yourself and your communities, it's hard not to get angry when people are like this. I'm sure you've probably experienced it before too. And so I started unpacking some of the citations, right? They have this big blowout section right there on the other side of the image. One review of 500 mental health advice videos on TikTok found 84% to be inaccurate, right? Ultimately, what this article is an argument for, the authority of the psychologist and, the authority of the kind of medical establishment. That's what this is, right? Because if we can identify ourselves, we don't need them anymore. So I unpacked that particular article, that one, the citation number 4. Okay, let's dig into that. It's from this organization called PlushCare. And I'm like, well, who wrote it though? Who wrote this article? Because I think it's valuable to explore, like who's willing to put their names on something. But when I looked into it, the PlushCare team wrote it. Like, still, who is random people? Like, where's the responsibility here? Where's the kind of, if I had an issue with this article, who do I contact? And they say that it's medical professionals who just enjoy writing about health topics. It's not even presented as like a rigorous thing. And when you unpack the article a bit more, right, they're like, what do they consider to be misinformation? First of all, if you don't by default defer to the medical kind of like the norms of the medical authority, that's considered to be medical misinformation by definition to them, right? But also, does the video or source encourage people to identify themselves? By definition, then that means you're misinformation in this study, right? So even medical professionals who have talked about the importance of self-identification, like Dr. Devon Price, by this logic of this study, would be considered to be purveyors of misinformation. So by definition, anyone who thinks that neurodiversity exists and is a thing and that we're not just intrinsically pathological cannot be seen as authorities based on this study, right? And that's where you get this incredibly huge kind of like number that they got, right? They say 100% of the content for ADHD contain misleading information. And like usually with any kind of science, like if something's 100%, like that's a cause for pause. There's a lot of like noise in science and anything is seldom entirely 100%. There's always weird outliers. So the fact that they said that made me kind of suspicious of them. And I dug a little bit deeper into PlushCare. And I mean, they're a for-profit virtual healthcare company, right? They're not kind of like associated with a university or a government. They stand to make money off of people coming to them and treating them as authorities. And they were very recently involved in 2022 in a pricing class action lawsuit. So I think it's important to keep in mind, like, who, again, stands to monetarily gain from controlling our sense of our own culture. Because they do. This is them monetarily gaining from saying you have to come to us to understand yourself. Oh, how are we doing for time? A little bit more. I just also want to talk a little bit about this person and like her unpacking of another study, a Drexel study. Amy S.F. Liltz has kind of made a career for the past 15 or more years about talking about how the neurodiversity movement is bad for her child specifically. Um, you know, and in this article, it was in Psychology Today, which again is, a lot of psychologists and medical professionals read this, right? And she highlights this video or this study talking about the harms include the medicalization of typical behavior and the reduction of the services to the profoundly autistic. The entire autism community is united against pervasive misinformation on social media. She's changed language a little bit to try to like be more appealing to neurodiversity movement, but it's still an issue. And I want to highlight that second thing, right? Okay, so she's saying, oh, if you identify as autistic, you are preventing my son from getting services. Now, this is kind of part of a kind of a divide and conquer practice, right? Saying that like underrepresentation and connotation related to individuals requiring more intense service and support can lead to less awareness of their experiences. So this is stated in the introduction of the paper. She is quite right. The paper does say that. The paper does not provide any proof of that. That's just kind of like a thing that like self-advocacy people have said a lot, right? Like somehow me telling you all, I was identified as autistic, and also in conversations with a medical doctor in Ajax, Ontario, somehow I'm stealing resources from an autistic child who's nonverbal, right? I'm not getting any direct supports. And it kind of like it creates this it's scarcity and fear modeling that somehow because you're able to speak for yourself, the very fact that you're speaking for yourself is taking away from people who are more marginalized than you in terms of in this example, the autistic spectrum, right? Because I'm not saying that I'm the perfect representation of autism. There is no perfect representation of autism. And a lot of folks who are autistic, I can live by myself. I struggle sometimes. I don't always do a good job of it, but I can. A lot of autistic folks will always need help doing that. And that is a different experience than my own. And but by this logic, me speaking to you today is taking away from them, and I think that's kind of a divide and conquer strategy, right? She increasingly defines herself as the mother of a 24-year-old profoundly autistic son, again, using this functioning labels that aren't really medically grounded in the same way. A lot of people who are defined by anti-self-advocacy people like this have a whole bunch of complex and intersecting conditions and experiences that are affecting their way of navigating the world, right? Here, she specifically calls out the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network and saying that, yeah, like, self-identification is harming her child in particular. But again, I want to highlight, right, like, this person has made a lot of money, has made a career off of these kinds of arguments. And if we actually unpack the article that she's referencing here, the reach and accuracy of information on autism on TikTok, right? Like the article is about all kinds of autism discourse. So this is actually clumping together, the coercive caregivers and autism parents who are saying, "Oh, your kid has autism, give them bleach and that will cure the autism." Because that was a thing for a while, right? It was really upsetting. There's a lot of upsetting things, but it's clumping those people together with people who are saying, "We deserve our own rights and to speak for ourselves." And that flattening, first of all, is very suspicious and weird, right? And also, again, right, if you even adopt whatever they define as adopting an antagonistic stance against diagnostic protocols is enough to qualify as misinformation. So again, it doesn't matter how much expertise you have. It doesn't even matter if you're a healthcare professional yourself. If you talk about the limits of the current existing diagnostic protocols, you're spreading misinformation. We've seen this before, right, with the previous study. The whole Journal of Autism in Adulthood, which I think is a really excellent kind of collaboration between autistic researchers and advocates and own voice speakers and professionals, just doesn't count in this study. It's all fake. And again, just emphasizing, Amy Lutz has made a lot of money, done a lot of books on this topic. I've already talked a little bit about the issues with profound autism as a category. It kind of exists in this dialogue with like things like Asperger's and like high and low functioning and why that's an issue. Okay, so I want to wrap up here and open up the space for more discussion because I recognize that I've talked at you for a while now. I would argue that like social contagion is just being social, right? I think arguably these debates about social contagion is just another way to make learning and learning together sound scary, right? I know there's a role for expertise, but like as someone who spent a lot of time studying the nature of expertise, it has limitations, right? It's important. You need to understand why expertise is there. But if you actually dig deeper and deeper into, you start to find the limits of various forms of expertise, and particularly in the case of how the medical community has historically related to marginalized people across the board, whether you're neurodivergent, otherwise disabled, Black, Indigenous. The medical establishment has a long history of screwing us over, even if sometimes it does help, right? Like it's ambivalent, it's ambiguous, like anything is when you get kind of into the nitty-gritty of it. And sure, neurodivergent people, we do tend to congregate with others like ourselves because for the same reason that any marginalized group does, we have common experiences, we share stories, we relate to people. That shouldn't preclude us from having a culture or think that we're just spreading a contagion or making people think that they're something that they're not. If all of the assistants or aids or self-care things for an autistic person help you, does it really matter if you're autistic definitionally, right? And sure, okay, and maybe we do overgeneralize sometimes. Everyone does when they talk about their culture. That's one of the things about having a culture is we just kind of joke about, oh, this is such a characteristic thing, right? Like, I don't know if there are any Nova Scotians in the room, but one of the jokes about an East Coaster is, oh, if I say the year was 1778, all the Nova Scotians have to activate like sleeper agents and go, how I wish I was in Sherbrooke now. A letter of marque came from the king to the scummiest vessel I'd ever seen. God damn them all. Right? I mean, it's a silly little joke thing, but I think that it kind of emphasizes this aspect of a culture. At the same time, I think there's a lot of room for us to create what we want neurodivergent cultures to be, right? Like even in the Nova Scotia example, I mean, Nova Scotia is a settler society and its culture is quite made up in interesting ways. If you're curious about this, I would recommend you read The Quest of the Folk, Anti-Modernism and Cultural Selection in 20th Century Nova Scotia from Ian McKay, written in 2009. And he does a really interesting job of it, kind of articulating the ways in which a Nova Scotia culture, which I grew up in, was kind of self-consciously made in like the early and mid 20th century, largely for tourist reasons, you know, like, and like, sure, I can say, oh, my family's background is kind of Scottishy German in Nova Scotia since the 18th century and so on and so forth. But like, there was a lot of self-fashioning and intentionality behind that to make it palatable and sell it to tourists, which is kind of interesting when you unpack the history of cultures like that. And so what? So what if our culture is a bit made up? That's what it means to have a culture. The question is, are you an autonomous agent? Are we allowed to be seen as having a culture? Are we allowed to be seen to have say in what we want our culture to be and the direction that it takes? And this is where, again, I highly encourage you to read the work of Dr. Devon Price. This particular work on Substack, Self-Identification is the Future of Autism Assessment, right, where he emphasized that we hold the collective like wisdom and organizing ability and insight and political will to define who we are. No authority figures have the right to sign off on our identities. And again, because I like to try to relate this in my own limited way to my understanding of Indigenous experience, if you have read Dr. Kim Tallbear's Native American DNA, I think there's some common cause there between the ways in which settler society, and in particular, like the genetic science, has attempted to dictate what indigeneity is in an external way that doesn't necessarily represent the interests of Indigenous peoples, right? Again, not entirely identical, but I think this is a very common move that kind of dominant cultures and oppressive power structures kind of do to us to say, like, you don't even get to define who you are. We get to define who you are. And that always comes out harming people. So again, just to kind of wrap up some of our main points, I'd argue that there is a strategic representational slipperiness to media depictions of neurodivergence from neuronormative sources, right? Like they'll represent it, but they won't say that it is that, but they'll make money from it, or they'll be slippery around it. Either it's often mentioned for pity or for inspiration porn or elements of sensationalism. But when characters are merely given stereotypical trait that's denied, remember what I said about the Big Bang Theory, and they're like, well, we're not laughing at them because they're autistic, we're laughing at them because they don't understand social cues, or they look and move funny, or they sound funny, and those sorts of things. And these can stigmatize and represent lived experiences and fuel those who wish to deny the existence of those experiences altogether. Oh, it's fake, or it's just like, really, in terms of like answering the question that was asked kind of before the talk, we need diverse neurodivergent creators to better represent ourselves to society. This is not just an important step in terms of culture, but in terms of medical resources. One character alone does not represent all of neurodiversity. It doesn't represent all of autism, right? We need a whole bunch more by own voice creators. right? And we've already done some of that ourselves in fandom and online spaces, but it doesn't necessarily breach containment into the wider culture. And again, arguing that the concept of fake disorder cringe and its professional equivalent, social contagion, has many similarities with homophobic and transphobic discourses. But we need to protect our cultures. We need to be given space, and not just be given space, but take space to define our own cultures. And not really, and to stand up when people try to capitalize on our identities for their own ends and for their own purposes, because it's not ever going to turn out well for us. So that's that. I'm sorry, I know I can speak quickly sometimes. That's why I am grateful that some of these talks are recorded so that people can listen to them on their own at their own time as well. But at that point, I would like to open up the floor for further discussion. Either things that I've said before, something that made you think about, or aspects that you'd like to see within kind of your own neurodivergent cultures for those of you who are neurodivergent, or concerns you have, because like autistic culture isn't perfect. There's a lot of things to be said about that too. But anyway, I'm going to stop the share. Boop. And oh, actually, before that, I'll put this brief view of some of my sources that you can check out in the recording. And I will stop the share.